Reform Judaism has changed quite a bit since the first Reformed synagogue was built before the Civil War in Charleston, South Carolina. If you've ever been there, you can walk through their museum and see that when they lay the cornerstone for the museum, one of the things that the rabbi said as they had planned to build this brand new synagogue in Charleston was that this here, Charleston, South Carolina, where the majority of Jews before the Civil War in America were living in Charleston or in and around Charleston, they said, Charleston is our Palestine. We no longer yearn for a return to the land of Israel. We have found our new holy land right here in Charleston. Now, Charleston's a nice place, but that's a statement that, looking back on the early theology of the original reformers in this country, is in many respects a black mark on our movement. The Reform movement didn't officially become Zionist until the mid to late 1930s. And even then, in the 1937 platform, they said, we, the Jewish people, need a land in Israel for those Jews who are in danger, not for anybody else. It was only Hitler, Yimach Shemo, may his memory be erased, that the Reform movement changed its view on the idea of Zionism. This is a betrayal, not politically. It has nothing to do with politics. There wasn't even a state of Israel back then. But it is, in many ways, a theological betrayal. We are now in the book of Genesis, Parashat Vayeshev. But I want you to consider, before I look at a fascinating take on this week's Torah portion, at how the book of Genesis begins and how the book of Genesis ends. Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, to which the Midrash explains how was it that God went about creating the earth. And it says he took a pebble in his hand and he flipped it up, and it went up in the air and fell into the water. And from that pebble, the world began to emanate and be created. Today, that pebble that God flipped rests. It's known in Hebrew as the Even Shtiyah. But it rests under a big blue and gold dome that sits on the Temple Mount called the Dome of the Rock. What's the rock? The pebble that God flipped up. Genesis begins by God first establishing Jerusalem as the fount of spirituality for the whole world. And Genesis ends with Jacob on his deathbed giving a blessing to all of the Shvatim, all of his sons who would be the namesakes of the 12 tribes, and apportioning for them what their stake is going to be in the land of Israel. You, the tribe of Dan, will live here, and you, the tribe of Naphtali, will be here, and Yisachar here, and he pointed them all out. In fact, the tribe of Dan was given the area known as Tel Aviv, which is called today Gush Dan. And the bus company, which is called Eged around the rest of the country in Tel Aviv, is called Dan. Why? Because at the end of Genesis, God said, this tribe of Dan, this is where you are going to be living. The very theology of the book of Genesis ties the Jewish people, not politically, religiously, to the land of Israel. In many ways, you cannot really live out the Torah unless you're in the land of Israel. There are over 100 mitzvot that are completely dependent on the land of Israel. There are no other religions like that. There are no other religions where you really can't even do a third of the commandments if you don't have a particular land. Yes, there are other religions that have holy sites and holy places, but none that have the entire first book of their holy writings, 100% committed to saying that the Jewish people have to be connected to the land of Israel in order to actually be Jewish. And so when the early reformers denied this part of our theology, they really did a great disservice. And I think we still feel the effects, in that too many Jews who live in the diaspora do not necessarily have that emotional relationship. Again, not with the state of Israel, not with the government of Israel, not with all of the issues with the Haredim and the Kotel and all these different things, but with the essence of the holiness of the land. Think about this week's Torah portion. Jacob, you know the story of Joseph. I mean, you've seen the play. Joseph comes to Egypt, and he becomes second in command of all of Egypt. And eventually, after his brothers come to him to procure food because of the famine in the land of Israel, he says to them, I want you to bring my father. And when Jacob eventually realizes that it is Joseph, his son, he says, Joseph, I will come to see you, but I will not meet you in your palace. I don't want to see how well you're doing. I don't want to see how comfortable you are in a land that is not supposed to be ours. And I will not come to where you are, but I will meet you in Goshen. Not Goshen, Indiana. Goshen, the area where the Jews were going to live when they became slaves. He said, there I will meet you, because I need to come and prepare this area. Because for many generations, our people will be living in this area. So Jacob comes, and there's a tremendous tension between Jacob and Joseph when he gets there. That's all right. That's all right. He's very emotional about Zionism. It's all right. I feel the same way. Jacob and Joseph. You would think that Jacob, after all these years of thinking that Joseph is dead, sometimes our kids do things we don't like, and it's okay. It's okay. Jacob's really angry. And you don't necessarily see the tension unless you look between the lines, because when Jacob is ready to bless Joseph, he says, Joseph, I'm going to bless you now. And you know what he does? He doesn't do it. There's no blessing for Joseph, his favorite son. Instead, he says, bring over your 2 sons to me. And I'm going to take your sons as if they were my first 2 sons. See, Jacob's sons, Reuben and Simon, they committed some bad sins and they lost their blessing too. And so what Jacob did was he said to Joseph, I'm not going to bless you. I'm going to bless your sons. But Joseph's a little dumbfounded, but eventually he decides to obey his father, and he brings for him his 2 sons, whose names are Ephraim and Manasseh. To this day, Jewish parents bless their children. May you be blessed like Ephraim and Manasseh. Most of these parents have no idea who Ephraim and Manasseh are, but every week they come and say, may you be blessed like Ephraim and Manasseh. Who are they? Well, one thing interesting about them, they're the first 2 brothers in Judaism from the beginning of the Torah that ever actually liked each other. So that's like a nice thing to bless your kids. Maybe you won't hate each other. But there's a different reason. Joseph loses the blessing, and he brings Ephraim and Manasseh in front of Jacob, and he puts Manasseh, the older son, by Jacob's right hand, and Ephraim, his younger son, by his left hand, and he says, give my older son the better blessing with your right hand. And my second son, you'll give a blessing not as good with your less powerful hand, the left hand. Torah hates the left hand. The Torah never envisioned pitching and what a advantage it could be. But the Torah always says the right hand is better. It's a baseball joke. So Jacob comes to Ephraim and Manasseh, and crosses his hands and puts his right hand on the younger son Ephraim and the left hand on top of Manasseh. And Joseph again is dumbfounded. What are you doing? Jacob says, I know what I'm doing. Here's what's going to happen. Because in the Torah, when a prophet gives a blessing, it's not just a blessing like I bless my son. Maybe you should have a good game today, and God willing it'll happen. Maybe you should do well on a test. When a prophet gives a blessing on the Torah, it's guaranteed to come true. It's one of the benefits of actually being a prophet. You know what's going to happen. So you give a blessing and you know it's going to come true. So Jacob says, Ephraim, you're going to get the weaker blessing. It's a good blessing. Manasseh, you're older, you're going to get a good blessing, not as good as I'm giving to the younger son Ephraim. And the good blessing that you're going to get, the famous prophet Gideon, who's going to lead the Jewish people, Manasseh, he's going to come from you. Okay, that's pretty good. Ephraim, it's time for your blessing. Who's going to come from you? And this is the key. The only way you'd understand this is if you looked in the Midrash or you see plainly how Rashi explains what's really going on here. He says, from you, Ephraim, is going to come Joshua. Joshua. At first glance, you might say, Gideon, Joshua, neither of them are doctors, but it's both pretty good. But there's something to it. You see, after Moses dies, right before he goes into the land of Israel, he says, Joshua, you are going to take over for me, which means you and your name are forever going to be synonymous with returning the Jewish people to the land of Israel. And what Jacob is saying at that moment to Ephraim is, you, Joseph, what you did not do for me, your son's lineage, Joshua, will do. Jacob could never really forgive Joseph because Joseph was comfortable as second in command. Joseph liked being in Egypt. Joseph was not going to take the Jewish people back to Israel. And if Joseph would have taken the Jewish people back to Israel, no Jews would have got stuck in Egypt and been slaves for all those years. Only Joshua later on would return the Jewish people to the land of Israel. What Parashat Vayeshev, this week's Torah portion, really boils down to is this blessing that Jacob understands that in order for the Jewish people to truly be the Jewish people, they have to have that connection with the land of Israel. And Joseph, somewhere along the way, lost sight of the importance of that connection. Benjamin Netanyahu was once asked in an interview, this area called Judea, which is Judea and Samaria, it's also known as the West Bank. They said to Netanyahu, what is your claim, you Jews, that the West Bank should be yours? After all, these are all mostly Palestinian cities and settled by the Palestinians. And Netanyahu just said to the interviewer, did you just ask me if the Jews have a claim on Judea? The prophet, the son Judah of Jacob, was the son who was essentially allotted this area and the area in which Jerusalem was centered. And in that area, Judea is from where the Jewish people take their name. We learn this in the scroll of Esther when the Tanakh teaches us that Mordechai was a Yehudi. Mordechai was a Judean. Mordechai is the first person that the Tanakh calls a Jew. To be a Jew is to be someone who accepts the Torah and also has an emotional connection and understanding with the land of Israel. And so you couldn't say, I don't support the government of Israel. It's too left-wing, it's too right-wing, it's too centrist. Falafel's too spicy, the hotels are too expensive, the flight's too long. Fine. But it's not okay to say anything is our Palestine except for the land of Israel. And as I talk to Israelis who make their way around the United States and more the United States than the rest of the diaspora, what they continue to find and we continue to see is that the emotional connection between Jews in the United States and the land of Israel continues to shrink and to shrink and to shrink. Miami's different. Miami's a Zionist town, thank God. But the problems are there. And it's about time that we are able to understand to be Jewish has nothing to do with our relationship to the politics of the state of Israel. To be Jewish means to recognize that we're the people who have the mitzvahs that grew from the fountainhead of spirituality from Jerusalem. As it says in the book of Psalms, Im eshkechech Yerushalayim, tishkach yamini. If I should forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Ken Yiratzon. May this be God's will. Amen.